Hello, and welcome to episode 192 of Prose. This week, pray for salvation from a ruined world, and honor the nameless dead. Please consider heading to prosepodcast.com, our one-stop shop for all things prose. There you can find links to social media, the episodes, a shop for swag, the show's Patreon, and more. On social media, like and share away. Most importantly, please do consider subscribing, rating, and or reviewing wherever you grab your podcasts and music. Thanks for listening. Let's get to the tales, shall we? This week we have Afloat and D.O.A. Enjoy. Afloat, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. Dispatch from Canucks. First Field Sergeant Malloy. Type. Personal log. Subject. Historical musings.
The floating ringed metropolises were a pie-in-the-sky dream of a not-quite desperate era. While the 21st century was still in its adolescence, the peoples of the world still thought global climate change something quaint enough to debate about. Oligarchs the world over hungered for even greater riches, supping on the dead through their exploitation of petroleum, coal, heavy metals, and gods know only how many other poisons, while also using antiquated methods and systems to manage that exploitation. Hindsight is 20/20 and all that, but it's damn near laughable to go back and read the political back and forth of the time of any nation. Even those nations that saw the writing on the wall still tried to rob Peter to pay Paul, as my great-grandmother used to say. Carbon offsets were ineffective, a pittance where a true, painful tithe was needed. But the Japanese embraced technology and novelness while holding strong to their traditions, and they began what started as a trendy phase of aquatic construction and subsequent aquatic living. The first cities held about 10,000, then 50,000, then 100,000. The data collected from these first floating cities only fueled the expansion and ability to grow the next wave of cities. In a matter of years, the trend was realized by a few more nations as the coasts continued to disappear and the weather patterns became increasingly disruptive. In those days, the only thing one could predict was the predictions would be wrong. Hurricanes, tornadoes, tsunamis, they were a plague. Tsunamis. That was quite the hurdle to get across for the original sea dwellers. But the engineers of even the earliest seaborne cities figured out that the circular designs, if built just right, would easily ride even the greatest of waves out in the stretches of the vast ocean. There was some maneuverability even in those original designs, so the only tsunami that would truly threaten one of the floating cities would be one that would dash them against the land. Hence, the floating cities, even in the earliest stages of populating them, rarely got near established land-based nations, which caused a rapid disconnection from language, culture, religion, from the backward-looking and backward-living terra firma humans. Of course, many of those terra firma humans were stuck on land by circumstance, not choice. As the rich abandoned what was clearly a sinking world for the floating cities, the poor were the last to be able to think of picking up and moving aboard. As always, they suffered and paid for the sins and indulgences of the wealthy. The gills, the pejorative the underclasses came to call the elite, were the first denizens of the floating cities, only allowed their underlings on board to be servants. And plenty of the less fortunate were willing to be all but enslaved to the gills in order to get their feet off the rapidly disappearing solid ground and onto one of those life-saving rings. Aboard, there was ample greenery, relatively clean air, no mandatory rolling blackouts, and so much more. Even with the servitude, the poor of the floating city had a better life than what they were suffering in the old world. There was never a shortage of servants ready to serve. In fact, for the better part of 3 decades, a spot on an ever-lengthening waiting list was all most could hope for. That was, until the world's first multi-trillionaire, Jeffrey Van Sylvan, single-handedly drove forth the Salvation Project. Just 5 years after announcing he was building his own floating city that would be large enough to host 150,000 residents, Van Sylvan had the city fully built, staffed by a skeleton crew and ready for populating. He called the craft Tsukui, a bit on the nose, calling it salvation in Japanese, but Van Sylvan wanted to honor those first Japanese innovators who had launched the movement so many years ago. Tsukui, as it turned out, was the first place where people were allowed in through an application process and background screening. Money was not part of the equation. In fact, Van Sylvan and his team made getting a ticket to reside on Tsukui damn near impossible for anyone beyond a level 3 wealth bracket. That is, the top 25% of earners in the Western European Central Authority taxation system. An archaic system, to be sure, but one that helped Van Sylvan serve those that truly needed a new home. The vast majority of Tsukui's residents, though, came from here in the Confederated States of America, the remnants of the USA. Because their politics prevented them from acting in any concerted way, their land and air and water were long since defiled by the time Van Sylvan's floating city came to be. Moreover, their third civil war all but crushed any ability of the peoples of that nation to enact any sort of counterbalance to the environmental harm that had been done and continued to be done. Van Sylvan took pity on these people who had so blindly worshipped economy over ecology to their doom and undoing. Tsukui could not house the entire world's population, but the intake staff did their best to ensure that the brightest, kindest, hardest working, most earnest peoples of the world found a place into the city. Unofficial accounts say that the members of the intake staff sometimes went days without food, a week or more without sleep, knowing that these decisions would likely mean life or death to a great many of those who had applied. To modern ears, that just means that Van Sylvan had arranged a proper team doing a proper job. No decent person wants to damn hundreds of thousands to water or fiery graves. With the air scrubbers on Tsukui, the heavily polluted air would even be made more bearable for those aboard, allowing for easier breathing while on the city, whereas the terra firma set would need to continue to improve upon the personal breather mask tech that had existed for some time. But that had been ignored in large part simply because, again, climate change was debated. Ancient history truly is ridiculous. People arguing against facts that they themselves could see, could taste, could breathe. It buggers the imagination. Then again, desperation breeds both belief and invention. So we find ourselves hurriedly building more floating cities. But there is only one Jeffrey Van Sylvan and only one Tsukui. The rich and their children will survive to hoard wealth for another day. though that wealth will quickly become obsolete as the planet decays. The poor will drown and burn and be buried alive and be swept or washed away and smothered, their lungs liquefying or calcifying or catching aflame from the noxious air. Salvation came for a few, but judgment will come for everyone. Soon enough.
In dispatch from Canucks, 1st Field Sergeant Malloy, type, personal log, subject, historical museums. Thank you for listening to Afloat, an original short story by me, Jared I. McGee. Please stick around for our next short story, D.O.A., coming up right now. D.O.A., an original short story by Jared I. McGee. I never knew his name. I saw him here and there around the apartment building. He looked older, but ambiguously so. He was as young as 65 and as old as 80. He was troubled, as we used to say back home. When you would come into or go out of the building, his bellowing shouts assaulted you. Was he in pain? Was he fighting internal demons alone there in apartment 1A? There was gravity and mourning to his wailing. Naturally, the residents feared him. They avoided him. They resented him. I never knew his name, but I did not fear or resent him. While the rest of us were off trying to get ahead at our meaningless jobs, diving headlong into the bustling Gotham, our packages would be delivered to our doors. Without fail, he would dutifully deliver these packages, taking them from a generic dropping point at the entrance to the building and up to each individual owner's door. He hefted even the heaviest of arrivals up and down those 5 flights, rarely using the elevator so as not to inconvenience other people. In a city where packages disappear more often than not, what an act of generosity and kindness this was. I myself had lost at least 4 packages in less than 2 years, and these were always during those odd stints where his shouting disappeared. Where had he gone? I could only guess. When I would cross paths with him, he would give me a thorough rundown of what weather was to be expected for the day. He saved me many a damp walk to the subway, his warnings of rain coming with a broad smile and unbelievable concern and earnestness. And kindness. He exuded genuine kindness when I took the time to speak with him. I never knew his name. And then when I was exiting one day, I had to elbow my way out of the apartment building, excuse meing through 15 or more police officers, paramedics, and firemen. Outside, I walked past 2 fire trucks, 2 ambulances, and 3 police cruisers, all with their lights on and rolling, and disturbing the otherwise quiet Saturday morning. The 2 women I had always assumed were the man's caretaker and or housekeeper and or social worker were outside animatedly speaking with a couple of the cops. My errand only took me 30 minutes, but the gathering there at my building had dispersed by the time I returned. Time is set at a premium in the city, so emergency services are nothing if not efficient. Upon entering, the building was still, echoey. No shouts, no shuffling, package shuttling. On the door to 1A, there was a neon green adhesive sticker, sealing the door and ensuring that no one could enter without breaking that seal. I am not often nosy, but I am a curious person at heart. So, instead of just zipping back up to the 3rd floor to grab my little dog and head back out into the morning for a long meandering walk like I normally would, I stopped to read the garish notice. Not much was there. The precinct number of the police who had sealed the door, a phone number, the instructions not to break the seal under penalty of law. But in letters triply as large as all the other script and doubly as bold were 3 more letters. D.O.A. Underneath was a time and date along with 2 sets of initials. D.O.A. So he had died. I never knew his name. He was a stranger to me, yet I was racked with sadness. Reading the notice felt like a literal blow to my stomach. I leaned back, propping myself against the slim collection of in-wall mailboxes across from 1A and just stood. Why was I so affected, so grief-stricken? The rest of the day, amid my dog walking and cleaning and paper grading and 100 other prosaic pedestrian doings, I couldn't shake that feeling of loss. Maybe it was because he was seemingly alone. Maybe it was because everyone in the building treated him like such a pariah. Maybe it was because I didn't do more to interact with him, despite his good nature, simply because he was different and loud. That was 2 months ago now. I think about him every time I enter or exit my building. I think about him when I'm in the middle of a workday. I think about him on my frequent runs around the reservoir. I think that he and I are a lot alike. I think that he is who I am apt to become. I think that I should be kinder to people. I think that we could all stand to be a lot kinder to one another. That poor man died alone and likely scared. And I never even knew his name. I never 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 knew his name. Thank you for listening to D.O.A., an original short story by me, Jared I. McGee. That does it this week for Prose. I truly hope you enjoyed the tales, and I look forward to joining back together in 2 weeks' time for our next regular episode. Until then, as always, love those around you, tell them that you do, and embrace this life as it is, stranger than fiction. Thank you so much for listening.